My name is Dr. Yara Osei, and for 11 years, I served as Earth's senior ambassador to the Galactic Council. I sat in that great amphitheater above the gas giant they call Vethon Prime, a planet the color of old bruises, and I listened to 700-year-old civilizations debate the proper font size for interstellar shipping manifests. I smiled. I took notes. I came back the next morning and did it again. I was very good at my job. So was my team. That was, in the end, the problem. The day everything changed began like every other day. The amphitheater was full. Representatives from 42 species filled their curved seats in descending rows, their translation nodes humming softly in the recycled air. I sat in the human section, 3 seats, because Earth was still classified as a junior member, a status we had held for 4 decades, despite fixing more of the Council's problems than any senior species cared to count. I had a presentation ready, 43 slides, a year and a half of data collected by the finest team of astrophysicists Earth had ever produced. We had been watching a region of space called the cauldron, a volatile stretch of gravitational currents, about 60 light-years from the Council's central trade corridor. For 18 months, our instruments had been recording something that made every scientist on my team lose sleep. The gravitational nodes in the cauldron were shifting, slowly, quietly, the way a crack moves through old glass before the whole thing gives way. We had models. We had timelines. We had a stabilization plan so precise and so efficient that my lead engineer, a young woman named Priya, had taken to calling it the stitch, because it would close the problem cleanly, the way a surgeon closes a wound, before anyone even had to feel it. I stood at the podium, and I presented all of it. I spoke for 20 minutes. I answered every question calmly. Ambassador Kethan of the Valori, senior species, 6 centuries of civilization, a being who carried authority the way a mountain carries snow, naturally and without effort, listened with his long fingers folded on the desk in front of him. When I finished, he thanked me. He said my data was appreciated, but premature. He said the cauldron had been stable for 300 years. He said the Council would revisit the matter next cycle. Next cycle was 8 months away. I gathered my documents from the podium. I walked back to my seat. I sat down. The session moved on to the next item, which was a trade dispute between 2 species over the mineral rights of an uninhabited moon. It went on for 3 hours. That evening, from the transit corridor outside the amphitheater, I sent a single message to the Secretary of Earth Affairs. I had written it the night before, which perhaps says something about how the session had gone, or perhaps only says something about me. The message was simple. It recommended the immediate suspension of Earth's active advisory role with the Council and the beginning of a quiet, organized withdrawal of our technical support personnel. All ongoing contracts would be completed to their minimum obligations. No new work would be accepted. I went home. People always ask me if I was angry when I made that decision. I understand why they ask. It seems like the kind of decision a person makes in anger, sharp and final, like slamming a door. But that is not what it felt like. It felt like setting down something very heavy that I had been carrying for a very long time. It felt like relief. The withdrawal took about 6 weeks to complete, and the most remarkable thing about it was how unremarkable it looked. There were no announcements, no press conferences, no dramatic speeches transmitted across the Council's communication networks. Human personnel simply became less available. Projects were handed off to the relevant species with thorough documentation and genuine goodwill. Consultation requests received polite replies directing the sender to the appropriate archived resources. New requests for joint projects received equally polite replies explaining that Earth's advisory capacity was currently under review. The galaxy did not notice immediately. This was not a surprise to anyone on my team. What we had learned, over 40 years of quiet service, was that the Council had a particular blind spot. They understood the value of our work in the abstract. They simply could not feel its weight until it was no longer there. It is the same way you never really notice the hum of a ventilation system until the room goes silent and the air grows still. I spent those months at home, real home, on Earth, in a house with a garden that had been neglected for the better part of a decade. I pulled weeds. I replanted the beds along the south wall. I had dinner with my daughter, who was 17, and had opinions about everything, and I listened to all of them. I slept without an earpiece for the first time in 11 years. I also kept my data subscriptions. I told myself it was habit. A person does not spend 18 months watching a gravitational anomaly and then simply stop watching. But if I am honest, which I try to be, it was something else too. It was responsibility, not obligation. I had met all my obligations. Just the quiet, private knowledge that some information matters too much to ignore, regardless of whose problem it officially is. The cauldron began to destabilize in the third month. The shift was small at first, the kind of thing that appears as a footnote in automated sensor reports, the kind of thing that gets flagged and filed and reviewed at the next quarterly meeting. But I had Priya's models open on my screen, and I watched the numbers move in exactly the direction we had predicted, at almost exactly the rate we had predicted, and I sat with that knowledge for a long time. The council sent response teams. 3 of them, from 3 of the senior species, each one composed of genuinely capable scientists working from genuinely sound theoretical frameworks. They failed. Not because they were incompetent, they were not, but because the specific variable that made the difference, the variable that Priya had identified and documented in precise detail, was sitting in a report that had been tabled indefinitely. It was not hidden. It was not lost. It was exactly where we had left it, in the council's own archives, under a timestamp from 18 months ago, filed under cauldron stabilization, human advisory submission, deferred. They did not look there. I suspect it did not occur to them that the answer might be sitting in a document written by a junior species. I watched the telemetry every evening. I made myself a cup of tea, and I sat at my desk, and I watched the numbers move. People ask me if that was difficult. The honest answer is that it was the most difficult thing I have ever done. Not because I was tempted to act, but because I had to keep asking myself the same question and keep arriving at the same answer. Was this cruelty? Each time I asked, I went back to the same fact. They had the information, every word of it. We had given it to them freely, in good faith, with full documentation, and they had thanked us and set it aside. The knowledge existed. What was missing was not the answer, but the willingness to look for it in a place that bruised their sense of how the galaxy was organized. I went back to the garden. I planted tomatoes, which seemed optimistic given the season, but I have always believed in optimistic gardening. 2 weeks before Priya's models projected the point of no return, a message arrived at the Office of Human Affairs, bearing the seal of the High Chamber of the Galactic Council. In 40 years of Earth's membership, the High Chamber had never addressed us directly. Their communications had always gone through the standard diplomatic channels, layered through 3 levels of bureaucratic courtesy, arriving softened and slightly blurred, like light through old glass. This message was direct. It was also, to its considerable credit, honest. Ambassador Kethon had signed it personally. I read his name at the bottom of the document, and I thought about what that must have cost him. Not the signing, but the asking. 6 centuries of institutional authority, and here he was, asking. The message stated that the cauldron situation had exceeded the Council's current response capacity. It stated that 3 intervention attempts had failed. It provided the current casualty projections, which were written in the careful, neutral language of official documents, but which described, underneath that language, a great many people on a great many worlds, in a great many kinds of danger. It formally requested the return of human technical advisory support, with full operational access, and it included, and this was the part I read 3 times, a formal retroactive acknowledgement of human contributions to Council stability over the preceding 4 decades. That last paragraph was only 4 sentences long. I have no way of knowing how long it took to write. I sat with the message for a full day. I walked in the garden. I called Priya, and then I called the rest of the team, not because I had not already decided, but because they had earned the right to be part of the decision. I told them what the message said. I told them what I was thinking. I asked them what they thought. Priya's response was to share her screen. She had a fully updated version of the stabilization model, revised to account for the 3 failed interventions and their effects on the cauldron's current state. She had been maintaining it continuously for 3 months, so had the rest of the team. Every one of them had kept their models current, without being asked, without any expectation that the work would ever be used. I looked at their faces on the screen. Scientists who had spent a year and a half on a problem that nobody thanked them for, who had been dismissed and overlooked, and who had spent their time since then, quietly, privately, keeping the solution ready in case it was ever needed. I told them to pack for a deployment. We went back, not with speeches, not with conditions, not with any of the machinery of grievance that we might have been entitled to bring. We went back because people were going to be hurt if we did not, and because that has always been, at its most fundamental, the reason humans show up to things. The stabilization operation ran for 11 days. There were moments when I was running on 4 hours of sleep, coordinating teams across 9 star systems, watching variables shift in real time, and making judgment calls that had no margin for error. My team was extraordinary. Priya did not sleep for the last 36 hours. There were solutions found in those 11 days that were not in the original plan. Solutions invented on the spot by people who cared enough about the problem to think beyond what they had prepared. The stitch held. The cauldron quieted. At the formal debrief before the high chamber, I was given the floor. I presented the updated framework, the lessons from the operation, and the revised long-term monitoring proposal. I spoke clearly, and I did not rush. When I finished, I paused for a moment, and I said one thing that was not in the prepared remarks. I said that we were not asking for a larger seat at the table because we wanted to be seen. We were asking because the table kept catching fire, and we seemed to be the only ones who had noticed where the matches were kept. The chamber was quiet for a long moment. Elder Vostrali of the Archon, the oldest member of the council, a being who had said fewer than 30 words in my entire 11 years of service, looked at me across the rows of curved seats. Then he nodded once, a slow and deliberate movement, and looked away. I sat down. That was 4 months ago. I am writing this now, at the same desk where I watched the telemetry every evening, with a cup of tea going cold beside my keyboard, and the garden visible through the window, the tomatoes having done better than expected. 2 weeks after the debrief, a message arrived from Ambassador Chthon. No official seal, no diplomatic formatting, just his name and a single sentence. We should have listened. We are listening now. I printed it. It is on the wall above my desk, held up by a single piece of tape at the top corner. Not as a trophy. I want to be clear about that. I have no interest in trophies. It is there as a reminder of something I think about more than I expected to. We walked away. People ask me if that was the hard part, and I understand why they think it would be. But it was not. Setting something down is not the hard part. The hard part was going back. Going back without anger. Without the quiet satisfaction of saying the words "I told you so," without doing anything that would make them feel small for having been wrong. Walking back into that amphitheater and simply doing the work, carefully, completely, with the same goodwill we had brought 40 years ago, that was hard. That was, if I am being honest, the most human thing we did in this entire story. We have always been good at the work. Any species can be good at the work. But going back to help people who dismissed you, doing it without bitterness, doing it because the alternative is watching something terrible happen and knowing you could have stopped it, that is something else. That is not talent. That is a choice, made deliberately, every single day. I do not know what the galaxy will look like in another 40 years. I do not know if the council will change, or how much, or how fast. Change in very old institutions moves the way the cauldron's gravitational nodes moved, slowly, quietly, in ways that are only visible if you are paying attention and patient enough to keep watching. But Chthon is listening now. That is something. That is, perhaps, enough to begin.